I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we're looking at 10 more Webtoon Legends contest entries. As you may know, I put forth a post on the Webtoon Canvas subreddit asking for people to submit their series to be reviewed, and we received countless responses. So, I am, of course, looking at these as contest entries. I'm reviewing them in terms of how well they set themselves up and how well they establish the general premise of the series, how well it sells itself to the judges of the contest. So I'm especially looking at pacing and just general setup. Now then, today we are going to be having a look at Astraea Saga, Life Still, OKOSHU, Kiss Magic Kill, SLUG Night, The Lost Spirit, The Watchmaker, Defeat 99, Dungeon Mama, and Skater Boy. And again, I am reviewing these in the order that they were responded to the thread. Therefore, if you submitted yours to be reviewed and it hasn't been done yet, it will be coming up. I'm doing them in the order chronologically that they were given to me. I will get through everything that was posted on the thread. It's just a matter of time. Although we are actually almost caught up. And so, in the interest of getting further caught up, let's go ahead and get started. So, first up is the Astraea Saga by Ahkurr. It is a fantasy action series. I'll go ahead and read the description and then we'll have a look at it. It says, "Welcome to Astraea, a planet of mages where peace among nations rests on the teachings of goddess Amnira, the great creator of the realm. Amnira alone wields the ultimate elemental force, ether. A long-standing prophecy foretells her return, stirring unease. Meanwhile, Arani, a 20-year-old aqua mage, earns a place at Nova, the most prestigious mage academy, but what she uncovers about magic, her blood, and the world's deceptive balance could unravel everything, if she dares to challenge it." So, we have a lot of interesting lore being set up here, and we are hinting at perhaps a deeper underlying story. Unfortunately, the uncovering part doesn't actually happen within these first 3 episodes, and so we're kind of left hanging a little bit on that. So pretty much what the description said is what this is about. It is a girl going to a magic academy in a world ruled by magic, and she has some kind of secret connection to a broader story. It starts out in the first episode with the girl and her parents casting some kind of ritual when they're interrupted by the magical police officers who arrest her father for his connection to some kind of cult. While mourning this situation, the girl then receives her invitation to the prestigious Magic Academy. Whenceforth she goes there, and then the rest of the episodes are spent with her getting introduced to her new roommates at the Magic Academy. And so, what immediately strikes me about this is that we're spending a lot of time getting our character established, which is important, but we aren't necessarily setting the tone, perhaps as neatly as we might want to here. So, as a fantasy action story, this is competing in most epic, and so for a most epic category entry, we want to make sure that we're setting an epic tone, that we're kind of showing what type of series this is going to be. Now, we spend a lot of time on the fantasy, but we don't get any of the action, and so, as readers, we're not sure, looking at this, what type of action we can expect from it. And so, if the story that we're telling here has a lot of lore and setup that's required in order to understand it, it's probably a good idea to either start with a flash forward or find a way to set up a scenario that, while acting as an introduction, also shows the types of action we can expect. So we see a little bit of magic, we get a little bit of explanation on how magic works, we get a lot of explanation on the background of magic, and a bit of the lore about the world and how the world works, but we don't get any of that fantasy action that we're probably going to be seeing later. And so while we're doing a good job of introducing the main character and setting up intrigue with her parentage and with her connection to this goddess and the visions that she's having, we're doing a good job of building that type of intrigue, but we really want to show what type of tone this story is going to have going forward, and so we really want to give a taste of that fantasy action that this is categorized as. And so there's certainly potential in this narrative, but it doesn't quite get to the point of showing us what it's capable of action-wise and tone-wise, and so I think perhaps rearranging some of these pieces or inserting some kind of opening sequence to really demonstrate what magic is capable of, maybe even repurposing the initial scene of the father getting arrested would be a good opportunity to show how magic can be used in combat or just used in general, and I think we just don't go quite far enough with that, and so we're left after episode 3 not really understanding enough about how it all works. And so yeah, this could be what goes on to be a very interesting series. It's definitely doing a lot of interesting things in its early stage setup. I'm only concerned that the pace might be a little bit too slow as a contest entry because, again, we just don't really have a good idea of what this action is going to be like, and so that's the type of thing that I would probably try to represent a little bit more, a little bit earlier. Otherwise, though, it's doing a lot of things right and a lot of things well, and I think that probably the coming episodes will get a little bit faster pace as it has time to start using the setup that it's building here. Go back and like all of these. So yeah, I'll be curious to see where this one goes and how it develops. Okay, next we have Life Still, which is an action series by Loomis. And the description reads, Dina, once content with a life filled with family and love, lost everything just before the world forgot how to die. Branded the most wanted fugitive in every known town for the crimes and misdeeds of her mortal past, she now lives constantly on the run. But in the endless cycle of death and rebirth, she crosses paths with a long-lost soul, one who would take a part of her, yet ignite life and purpose in what remains. What would you do if you had endless time and failure is no longer an option? Well, let's go ahead and dive into this series and we'll have a closer look at it. So, the first thing that stood out to me with this one is that it has a very striking visual style, and many of the panels are very nice to look at. Although, story-wise, it was a little bit harder to understand, so we spent a little bit of time in our first episode setting up some more recent backstory about the king murdering all of the farmers for some reason. Well, for no reason, as it's told to us. And then we kind of dive into this action sequence between our main character and some type of enforcer that is hunting her down. And we get a decent series of action set pieces of these characters just fighting each other and kind of explore a little bit firsthand what the undeath process looks like in this world where anyone that dies instantly comes back to life. Any damage that they sustain is regenerated in an amount of time. In the case of our main character, she apparently revives faster. She regains limbs or heals injuries much faster than other people who have to wait several minutes for it. But yeah, we get a series of these action pieces, but it's a little bit harder to follow because we don't necessarily know why these characters are fighting, other than the obvious setup of our main protagonist being a fugitive that is being hunted. But I guess a better way to explain what I mean is that we don't know why our main character is fighting the way that she's fighting. And so we know that nobody can be killed in this world, and so we have her go through this sequence of just beating up this enforcer, only to then attempt to shoot her in the head lethally. but she's thwarted at the last second by an interloper. But it just kind of begs the question, if her plan was to kill her all along, why go through the trouble when she always had the upper hand in this confrontation? And so, what are these lovely action sequences actually for, if it's just a prelude to a swift execution anyway? Something else that kind of stood out to me was that, though the action is very, very well drawn, it doesn't all quite flow, and so that's the type of thing that I really look at in a sequence like this, where we've got this beautiful silhouette shot, and we're showing what is essentially a combo attack from our main character, throwing a series of punches and kicks, but we go from a straight punch to the face to a flurry of punches in all direction, and by this point their hands are connected by a throwing star, and so we've got that anchor point, but the momentum doesn't quite match, and so here we have a heavy blow to the face, and our enemy here is falling down, but it's followed up by an attack to the stomach, which wouldn't really be lined up well. And so now her momentum is moving upward, and she's kind of ragdolling a bit, but we follow it up with a shot where she's being uppercutted to the chin, which just feels like it doesn't really flow. And so with a combo like this, especially if we're gonna go through the highlighting process of putting it on silhouette, it should really feel like all the moves kind of flow into each other, whereas reading it in sequence like this, it seems like disconnected shots. And so that's just something that kind of stood out to me. Alright, and so we go to the next episode, and another thing is that we have a timeline that feels a little bit hard to follow in this scene. So initially the confrontation begins. Our main character is hiding behind a rock at the bottom of a hill. The lackeys of our antagonist run down the hill to chase her out, but then it turns out she's not at the bottom of the hill. She's actually snuck to the top and starts attacking the leader. And then we have the lackeys scrambling to climb back up the hill, and we get multiple shots showing us that they're on the way. They're still climbing the hill, but they never actually make it there, and so it feels like there's a little bit of a dual timeline going on, where it takes these guys a couple seconds to get down the hill, but there's an extensive action sequence that happens in the amount of time it takes them to climb back up it, and then they get stopped by these strings from this other character, and then they're never mentioned again, and they just kind of stop existing in the scene. And now we bring another character into things, and it isn't really clear why this other character is here. And overall, I would say that, again, while beautifully illustrated, the execution of the sequence just kind of leaves me feeling a little bit lost and confused. And then we have this constant narration that's intercutting things, explaining things that we could just show through artwork, and so it feels at times like notes from the script are being placed into the episode instead of drawn as a panel, and it just feels a little bit disconnected, and so it's kind of hard to follow at times. And I mean, again, there are some really nice shots here, there are some really interesting ideas here, but it's just a little bit hard to follow. So here we have, this is our main character holding the gun. It gets taken out of her hands, and then the thread-wielding character tosses the gun to the antagonist, starts casting threads again, and now we're immediately at a sequence where our protagonist is completely wrapped up in webbing, and so it feels like we've skipped ahead a little bit here. How did our protagonist allow herself, after being disarmed so simply, to then be entirely wrapped in twine like this, when we know that she's a very competent fighter and very skilled? And so it's just, in an action sequence like this, it just needs to be kind of conveyed, like how we got from point A to point B, especially if we're meant to believe that our main character is in fact one of the better fighters here, and so there's a little bit of a disconnect in some of the sequencing. And we have a bit more of this kind of with our third episode, where all of a sudden our main character at the end of episode 2 was shot and executed, and therefore she's dead and is being reborn, because everybody comes back to life in this world as soon as they die. But we jump from her resurrecting, to now our antagonist has no arms and is running away. And it isn't quite clear how we got here. We can kind of assume, but we're just skipping around a little bit, and then the sequences just feel a little bit disconnected, and so it's kind of hard to follow, even just physically, what's going on. And then the story, the writing doesn't give us a whole lot, and then we're just, again, constantly intercutting with this narration. I just feel that at times there's a disconnect between what we're explaining and what we're seeing, and so I'm not really sure what to make of it. I also don't really know what our main character's motivation is here. We know that she's vengeful, she's upset about the past, particularly, I assume, the farming incident mentioned at the beginning of the series, but we also know that nobody in this world can die, and so it's not really clear what her goal is, if she's just going around beating up members of the military and then ultimately having them reborn afterward. Like, I can't really grasp what the purpose of this story is. And so it has a really interesting visual style. There's a lot of flair to it. It's very stylized, and it's very poetic in the way that it's written, but I just feel like I'm not quite getting it. I'm not quite following what exactly it's trying to do. And so hopefully with further episodes, we'll be able to get a more close look at what our characters are trying to accomplish, who they are, what goals they have, and more along those lines of what the structure of the narrative is. Alright, next we have OKOSHU, The Spirits of Ahkurr by Kaleo. It is a supernatural fantasy. The description reads, deep in the haunted forest of Ahkurr, Mapilo races against time to save his sister Wakiri after she's been captured by Astraea's enforcing brigade. But this is no ordinary forest. Ancient forces twist the path, and nothing is what it seems. As the siblings fight to be reunited, they'll first have to face their greatest demons, the ones that live within. Right, so our story begins with one of our characters already having been captured, and we are following the brother as he is pursuing her captors through the forest to try and get her back. And I found that the sequencing of this narrative was also a little bit confusing. It feels like it's setting up things that are obviously going to pay off later, but there's a lot of setup, I feel, in this 3-episode entry that doesn't pay off within the entry, and so it does leave us wondering, which is good. We want to build some curiosity, but it also feels like we're missing the answers to some of our foundational questions, and so I think that perhaps a little bit more would have helped really get people invested in this story. So we start with our brother character, and he's being pursued by a spirit, and he's constantly got this bug flying around him, which is distracting him as he goes, and it kind of causes him to stumble forward on his journey to find his sister. But we spend the whole first episode following the brother as he's following in the footsteps of his sister's captors, and then in the second episode we jump to the perspective of the sister, and the brother is then never shown again until the end of, or never shown again over the course of the remainder of the episodes. And so it feels like we're starting our story from the brother's perspective, and we think that he's the main character, but by the end of the entry, it's actually about the sister, and the brother is no longer on screen at all. And so it really does feel like we should have picked one perspective or the other to focus on, because we do a lot of work in this first episode setting up the brother as a character and kind of building up his capabilities, and also this spirit that appears to be haunting him, that's inconveniencing him, causing him problems, and has some kind of issue with him. But since all of that gets dropped in favor of following the sister's storyline, it feels like that setup didn't really go anywhere. And so for a longer narrative, that would be fine. But if we're trying to sell the idea in 3 episodes, then we want to make sure that every piece of screen time in those episodes is used to help build up what this story is actually about. And so I think that focusing on one or the other characters might have helped us kind of keep a more focused narrative and establish the world a little bit better. Something else I wanted to point out, this is a minor thing, but I do think it's worth mentioning. We have little extras at the bottom of each episode, including this here, episode credits track, Slipknot Duality, and a official photo of the band Slipknot. So this is a minor note, but on Canvas or on any other free hosting platform, this type of thing probably doesn't really matter much, but as a contest entry, it's important to keep copyright in mind. And so this being an official band photo, it will be copyrighted, it will be subject to royalties and things like that. And so submitting this as a contest entry, you are claiming copyright over it, which is a legal dispute. And so you should not use official imagery that you don't own the rights to in your contest entry. You're not supposed to do it on Canvas either. It's just that it's less of a big deal there, but as a contest entry, Webtoon claims the rights to everything that's entered. It's in the rules, and so this is that type of thing. While it may seem silly, you could get disqualified for this, and so it's important to just kind of take those types of precautions and make sure that you are following the rules to the letter. And yeah, I would advise against doing things like this for a contest entry. Okay, let's go ahead and put a like on that. We'll move on to the next episode. And so the second episode was a little bit confusing to me, just in kind of, again, this is where the focus shifts. And so we begin with the brother. He's chasing the cart that his sister is entrapped in as it's riding away from him. But as we introduce the sister character, we talk a little bit about spirits and build up the world lore, which is all very good. It helps us to understand kind of what's going on and why it's going on, and that's well wrapped in a simple conversation between 2 characters that helps inform the audience. That's very good stuff. But then we get to this point where the brother is right about to catch the cart as it's riding away down the forest path, but the spirit pursuing him causes him to stumble and fall. And then he just lays on the ground and cries as the cart rides away, but it's not really clear why he can't continue to pursue the cart. It kind of, the way it's portrayed gives the impression that he's just sitting there watching it ride away. Whereas before we've seen him kind of climbing around, swinging around. There's no reason to believe at this point as a reader that he wouldn't be able to get up and continue pursuing it. And so it feels like something's missing here. It feels like there's a lack of clarity in what's actually going on, because he appears to be hard prevented from continuing his journey, but it's not clear why he can't get up and continue. Seemingly, I mean, I would imagine the cart is just following a road. I mean, it's a horse-drawn carriage, so this is one of those minor nitpicks, but it needs to be made clear why he can't just get up and keep walking after it. I mean, eventually, if he continues pursuing it, he'll find the place that it's heading to, right? So it seems like something's kind of missing there. And again, this is the last time we see the brother character. He's not mentioned again until, or rather, over the course of the remainder of the entry. And so it feels like this plot thread kind of just gets dropped here, even though I know that in the story itself this will obviously come back up later. It seems unresolved for the contest entry, and so this is the type of thing that if we're going to spend an episode and a half setting it up, we want to make sure that we're keeping it in the mind of the audience as we go forward. And so this is something that could be used as a good hook later, maybe have the brother arrive at the prison that his sister's being taken to or something like that, but having his part of the story end here and just get dropped after this point feels like a bit of an oversight, and it feels a little bit disjointed. And so from here on out, we're following the sister. She's being taken into some kind of prison. And this sequence really confused me a lot, but we have the carriage being brought over a bridge and into this prison. The sky turns pink, and the guards watching the prison appear to be attacked by monsters. And so it seems like there's a battle going on outside the carriage. But nothing affects those inside, and they're calmly helping each other through this situation, and then the monsters are never mentioned again, and so it isn't really clear what happened. I'm not sure if these are even the same scene. It was very confusing as a sequence, and so I at this point, I'm a little bit lost in the narrative. And again, just worth mentioning, The Legend of Zelda, that would be a trademarked brand name. If you even so much as put that in your episode, you're potentially opening yourself up to problems. This is where it's something that almost every official webtoon does, is that if they so much as mention a real brand or a real logo, they always have to alter it in some way, because even though it's very unlikely that any of these companies are going to take legal action against, a webcomic, it is something that you open yourself up to when you're using other people's intellectual property. So it's just kind of worth mentioning that this is something that, again, for a Canvas series, it's probably not that big of a deal, but for a contest entry, you want to avoid doing that. Anyways, our third episode, we kind of end with the introduction to the prison and establishing kind of what goes on there and this horrible scenario that our sister character has found herself in. And so all of this is clearly setting up events that are going to come later. It does a good job of that. It does a good job of kind of building that additional intrigue and showing us the types of things that can happen here. But I do feel that for a 3-episode contest entry, it seems like we've chosen a strange part of the story to use as an introduction to the story, and so we kind of end on not really a cliffhanger. We kind of just end on a simple moment that we've established the scenario, we've established our key characters, and we've kind of set up a lot of the background lore in the world and the magic and the spirits, and all of that is very good. But in terms of where the story is going, it's a little bit hard to say. It's a little bit hard to predict at this point. And so I think that shifting the focus of these 3 episodes to building out the broader narrative would probably help us get more invested in it. And so I'm very curious to see where this goes. I just feel like by the end of it, I don't quite know enough about the overarching narrative. I don't really know enough about this enemy nation that's kidnapping the spirit users and kind of what their goals are and why they're bringing them to this prison and why they're having them dig an endless hole in this prison and dig up these roots. And I'm left with, I think, a lot of questions, which can be good. It's good to have some lingering questions to build curiosity, but I do feel like that there are some foundational questions that I wish I had answers to, such as who are our main characters, our brother and sister, what kind of background do they have, what are they capable of, and how did the sister get captured, why was she captured, why is this prison the way it is. I just wish I knew a little bit more about kind of what's going on in this one. And so it does a lot of things well, and it creates a very interesting setting, and so I'm definitely intrigued by it, and I would like to see more of it. Although, as a 3-episode trailer, essentially, as an introduction to the series, I do think that shifting the focus maybe would have helped sell the idea a little bit better. It is worth mentioning that this is an ongoing series on Canvas, however, and so if this is intriguing, there are more episodes on the Canvas side that can be read through, which probably do have answers to some of my questions, and so I may check that out. Okay, next up we've got Kiss, Magic, Kill, which is a crime mystery romance by Rebecca C. and Kixdibu. The description reads, Professor Athena Verity, the uptight astrology professor who looks like she could kill you, but is a cinnamon roll. Professor Holly Jones, the dangerous magical outlaw who looks like a cinnamon roll and could totally kill you. A shocking series of murders at Aldwych Academy forces the two to work together. Can they survive a deadly curse long enough to identify the culprit? Of course. Can they also ignore their strangely powerful attraction to each other? Outcome uncertain. So first off, I just want to take a moment to poke you about the grammar here, but this initial bit here, I think this is a fragment. This isn't really a sentence, and so maybe reformatting the description would kind of help us get a good idea of what we're in for, but this does, I think, set the stage pretty well. And so let's go ahead and dive in and have a look at it. So, Kiss, Magic, Kill. What we have is effectively a murder mystery at a magical academy in the middle of the woods. And what the story is about, it is an outlaw, a dangerous outlaw, who finds the murdered body of the new art professor at this magic academy, and so assumes her identity in order to try and find out who murdered her. And I found this very confusing at first. It took me going back a couple times just to kind of establish what actually happened, because again, what we have is an outlaw assuming the identity of a murder victim in order to solve the murder, but I initially assumed that she was the one who murdered her, although by the 3rd episode it seems like the implication is that's not the case, that she just happened to discover the murder and is now trying to solve it. But since she's described in the story by her own admission as a dangerous outlaw, it isn't clear why she's trying to solve the murder. It isn't clear what her goal is. And that kind of sets us off on a very confusing foot. So we have the outlaw pretending to be an art professor, but trying to solve a murder. And then one of her suspects seems to be the other character, who is the astrology professor. And so they both suspect each other of having committed this crime for different reasons. And so our Professor Verity, she notices that the art teacher is acting strange and doesn't seem to be acting like a teacher, and so she picks up on the fact that it's someone pretending to be an art teacher. She picks up on the fake identity aspect, and the art teacher, the pretend art teacher, seems to pick up on Verity's suspicion of her, and so they both suspect each other. But I can't even explain it in a way that isn't confusing, because the entire scenario is just kind of confusing. And so usually, let's say with a mystery, it's kind of important that we understand who our key players are and why they are involved. And so if our pretend professor is in fact trying to solve the murder, that needs to be made very clear very quickly, so that we, the reader, kind of know what the stakes are with our protagonists. And so, yeah, it's kind of set up in a way that makes it seem like the art teacher is in fact the murderer, is in fact the antagonist. But it's also written in a way to heavily imply that she's not. And so it just, I think struggling to kind of understand who our key players are and what their individual roles are in this story. And yeah, as a mystery, I think it doesn't really give us that clarity initially. And I'm not sure if this is all intentional misdirection that's intended to act as that bait and switch that maybe will be a big reveal later, but it kind of just comes off as confusing and a little frustrating. And so there's a lot of things that this story does really well, and it is very fun to read. I like the way the characters interact with each other and the different personalities they have, and there are a lot of good moments of humor thrown in, but as a mystery, I found it very difficult to follow. One other minor thing that I noticed is that most of the story is told through close-ups. It does use the 3D background environments, and it uses them reasonably well, but there are a few moments, such as in the first episode here, where we don't really get establishing shots as often as we need. And so we have this first section where our outlaw is introduced, and everything's very well established there, but then when we transition to Verity teaching the class, we never get an establishing shot of the classroom, and so I think this is done as a way to avoid having to draw all of the students simultaneously, which is very, very understandable. But when I first started reading this, I didn't realize that it was actually a class being taught, because we never see the class, we just see a couple of individual students, and so it seemed more like it was a consultation, like in the headmaster's room or something of that nature. Since in a scenario like this, when we only establish 2 or 3 characters on screen without hinting at the class in the background, it just kind of feels like those are the only ones in the scene, but it was later revealed to be an active classroom. And yeah, just little things like that can sometimes make it a little bit tough to follow what the scenario is, but that doesn't happen in every scene, it's just every now and then, and so something worth noting is just, yeah, the use of establishing shots is very important. But yeah, I did find myself very intrigued by this story. It's just, as I said, it was kind of difficult to follow what I was meant to be following. I'm not really sure about certain aspects of one of our main characters, and again, I'm not sure if it was intentionally confusing, or if it's a misdirection, or if it just kind of maybe wasn't set up as well as it was meant to be, but yeah, I really am just not sure what to think about it. That said, though, I am certainly curious about where it goes next, and I look forward to finding out the answers to some of my questions, so good job on that. Okay, next we'll be looking at SLUG Night by Giamon. It is an action fantasy, so the description reads, looming on the horizon is an ominous hurricane, seemingly frozen in time, threatening the world. No one knows when it will strike again or how much destruction it will unleash. Radna and Ina are among those seeking to destroy the core of this mysterious phenomenon. But before their real journey begins, they're assigned to a quiet task, to watch over the village of Graveworth every time the rain falls. Alright, so this one is an action fantasy series, and it does do a good job of showing us action right away. We start with a tragic backstory, a flashback to kind of how our heroes began, and then we cut to the present where we show the strength that they've gained as they've grown. And so we kind of demonstrate some of their fighting capabilities, and we introduce our characters and their ideals and kind of their strengths by showing them fighting each other in a sparring match. And so this is all very good. That's the type of thing that it's a very good way to start an action series, by having an expositional battle that demonstrates the capabilities and the type of tone and the type of combat that we're going to be getting. My only concern with this one is that perhaps it only goes about halfway, and so we learn over the course of this battle that our green-haired character here uses wind element, and our gray-haired character uses earth element, and so it seems like the implication is that they're magically enhanced in some way, and that's informing their combat abilities. But then we find in the next scene, as we introduce their mentor, that neither of them knows how to use magic yet, and they're begging him to train them, but he doesn't quite remember, or he doesn't deem them ready yet, or something to that effect, and so it isn't clear if he's confused in his own right, or if he's acting vague in order to bring out something in them to set them up for self-discovery instead. It seems like a little bit of both, but we then go back to the village where our characters, as established, are meant to watch over the village when it rains, and so if it starts raining, they need to keep watch. Apparently, being far enough from the whirlwind storm that is threatening the world, they don't usually have any trouble here, but this time it's different. This time a monster appears, and it immediately starts killing the people set to guard the village. Now, the thing that struck me instantly about this altercation is the monster that appears that they then have to fight is a disgusting eldritch abomination, and it feels very tonally different from everything that we've seen so far, and it doesn't feel like it really matches quite with the setting. And so we've seen our characters fist fighting each other, and there's hints at magic powers that they'll have later, but it isn't clear how being good at fist fighting and kickboxing is going to help them fight a demon with 10 tongues and 3 mouths, and it seems like something is not quite adding up here. So the type of combat that we've established doesn't seem congruous with the type of enemy that we are now facing, and so this seems like something that you would probably not fist fight, and it's just not really clear how the specialties that the characters have are going to benefit them if this is the type of monster that they're going to be up against. And unfortunately, the third episode does kind of end in the middle of the battle before we get our hero moment, and so we don't see the characters awaken their magic powers, and we don't see how they are going to overcome this first encounter that they have, and so it does feel a little bit like we've ended before we got to the part that would really build our investment in these characters. And so as a first introduction to this world and to these characters and to their aspirations, we really have built up to this hero moment where our main characters surpass their limits and they overcome this intimidating force that they have never dealt with anything like before. But we kind of end right before that part happens, and so there's a few lingering questions I have, which is, well, how does the magic work? The magic that they're begging this old man to teach them, and I assume that we're going to get that. We'll get the answer to that in the continuation of this fight. It just would have been better, I think, if we got to see that, because we still don't really know what the highest level of combat looks like in this series, and so we've done a great job of introducing the very fast-paced, brutal hand-to-hand combat in our first episode, and a little bit here as well, and it's all very, very well illustrated. It flows really well, and so that's a very, very good showcase of the types of things we can expect from this. I just would like to see maybe a little bit of the magic that we've been hinting at, and kind of how that's going to help us defeat these weird abominations that we are apparently going to be fighting against. And so I do think that this does a very, very good job of establishing the world, establishing the lore, the characters, and also the stakes of everything. And so it essentially has set up everything important that needs to be set up. I do just wish that we had got to see the end of the fight, but there is certainly a lot of good stuff here, and I think that it pretty much does everything right, and so hopefully we will get to see the continuation of that fight. I'll be very curious to see where it goes from here. Alright. Next up is The Lost Spirit by Sai Dano. It is a supernatural crime mystery. The description reads, a child wanders into the spirit world searching for a lost friend, meeting a suspicious spirit who offers to help. This story is inspired by folklore from the Caribbean. I hope that you enjoy it. So, the description here actually does do a pretty good job of explaining the entirety of what this is and kind of giving you an idea of what it's about. And for the most part, it was very, very accurate. So a boy wanders into the spirit world looking for someone. He manages to gain the sympathy of the first spirit he encounters, who agrees to help him find who he's looking for. And so this faceless spirit comes along with him and acts as his guide in the spirit world, helping to point out things that he needs to be aware of and trying to keep him from making deadly mistakes. So, essentially, it's pretty efficiently done. Again, it introduces us to every important concept, but when we really start going, it does feel a little bit like a guided tour of the spirit world, almost like an educational program, in the sense that every time something of intrigue comes up, our masked character stops to explain it in a very, very basic and straightforward way. And so it feels a little bit like passing exhibits at a museum, where every time we see something strange in the spirit world, our character stops to explain it to us. And so it spends most of its time essentially doing that, explaining the rules of the spirit world and the different types of spirits there and the things to watch out for. Whereas I do think we could probably spend a little bit more time on building tension and building drama and kind of establishing our characters a little bit better, but it does keep the pace moving. We do continue forward, and we even have a little bit of a interesting situation play out where we have an altercation with this spirit. Spirits often feed on the souls of humans, and humans are not supposed to be in the spirit world. And so when we have this confrontation with this, shall we say, antagonistic spirit, our main character bites him, seems to absorb something from him, but we don't really know what exactly he's done. And it's hinted that he's beginning to change in some way, but we don't really know how, because it's not clear to him or any of the characters what he's actually gotten himself involved in. And so that leaves us with interesting setup for later events. And so, yeah, just as a sort of divine comedy take on this folklore spirit world, I think it is interesting in that right, just kind of slowly introducing all of these different concepts and explaining the lore to us as we go. I do think that a little more detail, a little bit more character and personality could perhaps help, but otherwise it does very well. And so I'll be curious to see how the story unfolds. Okay, next is The Watchmaker, a supernatural romance by Tonki Papero. The description reads, late Victorian age, on her 18th birthday, Celine, I assume it's pronounced Celine, I'm not actually sure, but moves to London to pursue her dream, but her life takes an unexpected turn when she meets the mysterious Watchmaker, a man no one knows anything about, and who hides a disturbing secret. Celine will find herself involuntarily drawn into the Watchmaker's mysterious double life, uncovering a shocking truth about the world and time itself. A battle between supernatural beings that only Celine can resolve. After all, it's her, the missing gear. French pronunciations aside, let's go ahead and dive in and see what we've got. So, the thing that immediately stood out to me about this story is actually the most petty nitpick probably imaginable, but it was something that I just couldn't shake, and the entire time that I was reading it, this kept occurring in my mind. I'll explain a little bit more as we get into it, but so the story is about, again, as the description said, it's a French girl in the late Victorian era that moves to England to become a fashion designer. And so she's pursuing her dream, but she ends up getting wound up with this watchmaker who has some kind of supernatural situation going on, and somehow this is going to end up in some kind of time warping adventure, so it would seem. And that appears to be the implication, but unfortunately the first 3 episodes of this are spent on setting up our main characters, and so we spend a lot of time introducing Celine, and we spend a lot of time introducing our watchmaker and kind of building up that early interaction that the two of them have, and how their paths ultimately cross, how they come to know each other, and how we end up connecting these characters in some supernatural way. But the moment that the supernatural things begin to happen is when the story leaves off. That's where the cliffhanger happens, and so we've got a very, very good idea of our characters. We've done a lot of work building our characters' personalities and getting to know them, and all of that stuff is very interesting. But by the time we're done with the introductory episodes, we still don't actually know what the story is about, and so it's kind of hard to be invested in the broader story, because even though the characters are very likable, it's very enjoyable to watch the characters, we still don't know what this thing is about. And so as a reader, I find myself curious, well, what's going to come next? But as a webtoon editor, as a judge for the contest, it's kind of hard to know what we're actually signing up for here. And so I think that not necessarily speeding up the pace, but maybe doing more to kind of explain what it's actually about would help us here, because essentially what we have are 3 episodes of character drama, which are very engaging, but in terms of the supernatural aspect of it, it isn't really clear what that is. And I think that that's kind of important, since this is in the most gripping category. We want to know kind of what that gripping element is. What type of supernatural story are we actually getting involved with here? And I think we just don't know enough about that yet. And so everything else I found to be very, very well done. The art is great. This is a former originals creator from the French Webtoon app, and so like this is someone that obviously has the experience with building out this type of story and building out characters and the pacing and everything, and so they very clearly understand like what is expected from Webtoon. I only feel that it falls a little bit short in setting up what makes it in the most gripping category, what makes it in the supernatural genre. And so while I am again very curious to see where it goes from here, I just think that I would like to know more about the supernatural element. Okay, so I'll roll another episode ahead here. We're going to go ahead and put a like on every episode, even the extras. Now I'll get into my nitpick. So this was a very minor complaint, but it was something that, again, the entire time I was reading this, since it is essentially 3 episodes of character drama, the entire time I was reading this, I couldn't shake this minor nitpick critique. And so a lot of emphasis is put on our character's dream, which is to become a famous fashion designer in England. And so she wants to be a renowned designer of dresses, and her goal is to work at a small tailor shop in order to gain the money to eventually open her own tailoring shop. And so the implication is that she doesn't have a lot of funding and she needs to gain some. The entire time we're following her, she's wearing these extremely elaborate dresses and these very, very lovely outfits. And like, there's obviously a lot of care put into designing the outfits of the characters. And each day that passes by, our characters have different dresses on, and these very, very just over-the-top Victorian style outfits that are quite nice. But it kind of feels a little bit distracting that our character is meant to be essentially starting from nothing. She's starting from scratch. She even refers to the Watchmaker as middle class, and so it sets the implication that he is in a social class above her, that he has more wealth and money than her. And so the way that she talks, it's as though she's coming from poverty, but we see her constantly wearing these outfits that would cost several $1,000s, and so it's just a little bit distracting sometimes, even though it does make the characters very, very nice to look at. It's cool to see all these very well-designed outfits, but to see these women working at a tailoring shop wearing full get-ups and petticoats and bustiers and whatnot, like in bustles, and having their hair done to the nines, dressed for a ball, but they're working in a tailoring shop, they're sewing clothes. It feels a little bit disconnected, and so it makes it a little bit, it's just a little bit distracting. It makes it harder to get invested in the setting. It feels like we have to suspend disbelief a little bit in order to invest in the narrative and invest in the setting, that this is meant to be kind of gritty Victorian London, but we have people in ball gowns that are working at tailoring shops, and so that's just, again, a minor complaint. It doesn't matter to the actual story at hand. It was just something that stood out to me. But yes, otherwise, this was a very fun read. Again, it was paced very well, the art is very nice, and the characters have clearly defined personalities that are easy to understand and get invested in, and so it does do a lot right. It's just, as I kind of said at the beginning, I think it takes a little bit too long to throw us into the actual plot. And so, while the character work is exceptional, I think the plot work could be sped up a little bit. Alright, I'll go ahead and finish putting likes on this, and I think I'll go ahead and subscribe to this. I would like to see where this one's going. So yes, good job on that. And good luck. Okay, next we have Defeat 99 by Ginjni Alberto. It is an action fantasy. So the description reads, Lantos searches the world to find pieces for his hobby, collecting village songs. To get money for this, he works as a professional manjinjalad, a man whose job is to stage fights to make someone look good to people or create fake scenarios to mislead people. One day, he is hired by a rising warrior, Chief Terong, to win the hearts of the people of Ajianan village. The money offered was enough for Latos to take the job and show his manjinjalad skills, all for the money needed to buy more songs. Alright, so this is under the action fantasy category, so as such it is competing as most epic, and I think that this is a very strange and interesting narrative. I can't say I've ever really seen anything like it, but strange is probably the easiest way to describe it. So we have our main character, who is a manjinjalad. He is apparently a man who is, his job is to stage fights in order to improve people's reputations, and so he makes a lot of money doing this, as he explains. He shows off the many things that he's bought doing this, and how his wealth from doing so has benefited him. And he's on the way to a village when he gets into an altercation and encounters other characters that end up shaping his journey. But there are a lot of things happening in this. It seems to be written with intention. It seems like it's going somewhere, but it's a little bit hard to follow at times, just because so many of the elements that it deals with are so strange. And so There are a lot of concepts and ideas being introduced. We use a lot of what seem to be fantasy words to kind of explain some of those concepts, but we don't really get a detailed, in-depth explanation as to those different ideas or settings. And so it's not really easy to tell where we're at, what world we're in, and some things about the world. I think almost everything that matters does get mentioned, but some of them I wish that maybe we had a little bit more detailed explanations on. And so we learn as we go about different types of powers and different types of strength, and how everybody is born with a different blessing and how those things interact with each other. And so it does seem to have a good understanding of the type of power scaling that it wants to involve and the type of interactions that it wants to set up. And there are some fun and clever fight scenes that we get in this. But it does feel just a little bit hard to understand. And so some of that is the translation doesn't seem perfect. There's a little bit of weird grammar in places, and some of the dialogue feels like it just doesn't translate that well into English, and so that kind of adds to that confusing element of it. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to follow what's going on. It's just not always clear why the things that are going on, and so I think the narrative could best be described as lackadaisical. It sets a really interesting tone where it's kind of lighthearted, but it does get serious at times, and it's not really clear what the stakes are. It's not really clear what the conflict is. And so we have our opening fight scene, which is our character happening upon what seems to be a hostage exchange. The prince of the village is being sold off to cannibals, and our main character, the man Gingelad, stumbles in and prevents this. He beats up the cannibals and accidentally saves the prince, and then joins the man that was trying to sell the prince, and then goes back to the village where odd things ensue. But the man that he ends up traveling with notices that he seems to have a lot of latent strength, that he's very powerful, and so he tries to use him in a scheme to defeat the general of the local army, and they get into a fight which doesn't entirely resolve, and that's more or less where we leave off. And so it seems like a very interesting world that probably has a lot of thought behind it, but it isn't very clearly conveyed. And so I think a little bit more about the world would probably help us understand this a little bit better, but also, I don't know, a bit more of a focus to the narrative. And so over the episodes that we have here, the 5 episodes that we have here, it does feel like the focus is a little bit murky. Like our main goal is that our character is going to this village because he's been hired to offer his services here, but we never actually get to that happening. And so it just seems like a series of misadventures along what is presented as a relatively straightforward quest. And so I find it very fascinating, but tonally strange is probably the easiest way to describe it. And so it's not always clear what everybody's motivation is or why they're doing the things that they're doing. And especially when we get into our next fight, when our main character gets dragged into this altercation with this very strong woman, it just seems a little bit confusing what exactly is happening with this and why this is happening and where this is meant to lead. So I think perhaps expending a little bit more effort setting up the broader narrative, how all of this connects together, would, again, just help the reader to kind of understand what they're getting into. Whereas as more of a lighthearted adventure, it is fun. It just isn't 100% clear what the story is actually about, like what it is trying to accomplish. And it does kind of end in a bit of a strange place. I do think, again, it sets up a lot of interesting ideas, and I'm definitely curious to see where it goes from here, though. So, yes, good luck. Alright. Next up, we have Dungeon Mama by Nix Kuroi. It is a comedy fantasy. And the description reads, what's an adventurer to do when their babysitter quits and she can't go out and slay dragons anymore? She spends the next 15 years raising young adventurers and then calls in a favor to get them out of the house for a week and onto their own adventure. But what if the old friends she trusted with this task, blind with drunken jealousy, mess the whole thing up and send them into actual peril? Helchiko, aka the Sword of the Nine Skies, must descend into the dungeon herself. So, the description here gets a little bit ahead of the actual narrative, and this is something that I always point out, but where our series leaves off, our contest entry leaves off, is kind of around about halfway through the description. And so the rest of this hasn't actually happened in the contest entry. And generally, I think it's a good idea to make sure that whatever's in the description is represented in the episodes, because it does kind of help to set up expectations for where the story is going to go, what direction the story is going to go, but we really want to see how that is played out visually, how that's played out in the actual episode, and so how that is done in context. But otherwise, yeah, this story, I kind of struggled with this one because I think the best way that I can describe it is overwhelming. I found it overwhelming to read. It was almost exhausting at times because we have panels flying back to back to back to back without much spacing in between them, but then we also end up in a scenario where we have just giant walls of text balloons, and so a majority of the content of this comic is people having long, drawn-out conversations, and they all kind of speak in these paragraphs, and so it's a constant deluge of text and dialogue and just back-to-back panels with no room to breathe in between them. And so there are times where it's like looking at a newspaper where there's just as many articles and pictures as they could fit on the front page to kind of get and hold attention, to a point where it becomes impossible to focus on any of them. And so there were a lot of times where I had to pause this and go back and reread and just almost take a break from it because it's just so visually overwhelming. It's non-stop dialogue, non-stop speech balloons, and countless speech balloons on each panel, and again, the panels are right up against each other, and it's just cascading information on the screen. And so I think that breaking up the pacing a little bit more would help to follow it a little bit better, and simplifying some of this dialogue a little bit would make it a lot easier to read. The characters are very wordy. They speak in very, very long sentences and just at a constant rate. And so essentially what the description said is what happens. We open the story with our main character, our dungeon mama, saving the world from a dragon, saving some children from a dragon, and claiming another victory, claiming a lot more money, and then coming back home to find that her sister, who has been watching her children as she goes on these adventures, is tired of being in one place. She's been here for 4 years and she wants to move on. And so our character, Selchiko, decides to settle down and actually raise the kids. And then we fast forward to 15 years later, where now the kids are grown and they're going on an adventure of their own. And As you can see, the style of conversation and delivery is the same between the kids and the parents, and so we have several more walls of text and dialogue as the descendants of the main character are now going on an adventure of their own, forming an adventuring party of their own. They pick up a prince on the way and argue at length with him, and we see how their dysfunctional band of misfits is setting off to try and be adventurers of their own. Meanwhile, in the background, their mom goes to some old friends, the ones that she slew the dragon with many years ago, and tries to get them to help her stage this adventure for her kids to go on. And it's relatively straightforward, but it's not told in a straightforward way. And so, as I said, like, there are many panels like this where we just have walls and walls of text, and so it can be very, very hard to read at times. And I definitely found that if I scrolled past a panel like this, or sorry, not scrolled past, but if I read the dialogue of a panel like this and then scrolled down and found that another panel like that awaited me with just as much text, there were times where it made me want to stop reading. And so I just felt like it was an overwhelming amount of dialogue, to a point where I would get through one panel and then the next panel would come up and have just as much dialogue, and it would almost feel like a chore sometimes to go through it. So I think that simplifying some of these conversations and only focusing on the important dialogue would make it flow better and make it easier to read. And in many cases, sometimes less is actually much, much more. And so there's so much dialogue between the characters that it actually becomes harder to keep track of what they're talking about, whereas simpler words and phrases, simpler interactions would make it a little bit easier for the reader to follow. It would be easier for the reader to remember, instead of just having this, again, just oppressive wall of text. And so this is a story that has a lot of personality. There is a lot of subtle humor in the way the dialogue is written, in the way that the characters interact with each other, and that seems to be where the comedy comes from. But some of the effect is definitely lost just by the sheer amount of text that there is. And so that's something I think to keep in mind, is that oftentimes, especially with comics in the comedy genre, what you'll find is that simple is usually better. It's easier to deliver a joke in simple terms, and that's why most comedy in comic format is done in short comic strip style, where it's just a few panels, where it's not very long, not many panels, not much dialogue, not much text. It's just a very quick setup and payoff type of system. And so the way that this story is delivered, I think that putting it in the comedy genre might be miscategorizing what it actually is. So even though there is definitely a lot of focus on comedy in the dialogue, in the interactions that the characters have, because it's delivered at such length, I do feel like it's more of a fantasy first. Alright, and I'm gonna scroll through our character profiles right quick. We'll put a like on every one of them. I do think, though, that there is a lot of character shown in this, and I say character, not plural, so just the way that the personalities of the characters are written shows some depth to them. And so it's clear that a lot of thought was put into the characters and who they are and how they interact, and like different personality traits that each of them have, and so that makes them very easy to invest in. They're very believable characters, and tonally it is very lighthearted and whimsical, and again, as a comedy, it's not meant to be taken that seriously. And so I think that there are some fun scenarios here, there are some fun dialogues here, fun character interactions. I just think that there's a little bit too much text, and so some of that is kind of lost. It gets hard to follow. But yes, otherwise, looks pretty nice, and again, seems to have certainly some thought behind it. So good job with that, and I wish you luck. Okay, lastly, we're going to be looking at Skater Boy. It is an action superhero series by Ronan. And the description reads, one day he was just a regular guy. The next, he was Earth's last hope. When a princess from a distant planet appears, she warns him of an impending alien invasion and reveals that she has a hidden power strong enough to stop it. Thrust into a battle beyond his wildest imagination, they must learn to work together, protect the planet, and uncover the truth behind the enemy's motivation. The fate of the world is in his hands, whether he's ready or not. Oh, I would say that pretty accurately sums it up. As an action superhero series, we start with a flash forward where our character has already become the hero that he is going to be, and we see how his talents and abilities get used to stop three gentlemen that are apparently flying around. Three men are flying and have been rampaging throughout the city, so they're flying around the city and shooting guns without a clear motive. And the description does say that we will find out what their motives are, but it does feel a little bit hard to get invested in the conflict when we've got aliens that are just kind of committing random acts of violence. We don't really have a clear-cut conflict here, so we know that Skater Boy and his alien princess companion are going to be fighting against these antagonistic aliens, but it would definitely benefit us to have a better idea of why they're fighting, and also some of the opening section is a little confusing because we don't actually know right away what our characters do, and so something that I didn't catch immediately when I read this the first time was that the princess, the alien princess, is actually transforming into the skateboard here, and so her arm goes up in the air, it turns all swirly, and I wasn't sure what she was doing the first time I read this. I wasn't immediately sure that she was transforming, and so I just assumed that she was flying alongside him as he was skateboarding, because as Skater Boy, I figured that his skateboard was just a prop that he had, but it is in fact the princess that transforms into the skateboard, and we find out in the later episodes in the prequel section where we're going back and revealing the origin that she has the ability to transform into any non-living object. And so we have Skater Boy, who is a skater who essentially his only talents and abilities as far as we know are that he's good at skateboarding, and the princess, who is able to transform into different tools or weapons so that he can use them. But see, since we're constantly cutting between dialogue, they're having a conversation as they go, and we use faces to demonstrate that the princess is talking. I didn't realize initially that this was her as the skateboard, because since we're constantly seeing her face, it seems like she's just there with him in human form, and so that was something that kind of threw me off a little bit. And again, without understanding that she was the skateboard, I didn't realize that she was the hammer either, and so a little bit more visual clarity on that would kind of help build that investment in the character and kind of establish what it is that he does, what makes him a superhero, and what talents he actually has. And so again, it does get explained in the next couple episodes. It was a little bit hard to follow in the moment. Right, so our first episode is obviously a flash forward to Skater Boy being an action hero and fighting a battle, and so that's very exciting. I do often say that for an action series, if there's a little bit of a slow start, you want to make sure that your opening scene is something very exciting, just to kind of set the tone so that people know immediately what type of action, what type of series they're getting into. And so that's a very good decision here, since we're now going to take a little bit of time to slow down and show how the characters met each other and how they became intertwined as a superhero duo. I do think, though, that perhaps the fateful meeting between them is a little bit underwhelming. The alien princess just walks into a convenience store that Skater Boy happens to be working at, and we don't really know how she got there or why. She just shows up one day and says that she's probably being chased. She doesn't actually know at this point if she's being pursued. She just says that someone might come after her, and she asks to hide behind the counter. And then she does. And so we see her then demonstrate her transformation abilities by turning into a pencil. Skater Boy walks outside, now believing that she is in fact a shape-shifting alien princess. He walks outside for some reason, and then someone appears to chase after them, which is where we see the utility that the shape-shifting princess powers provide, because when the man chasing them fires a laser gun, she transforms into a shield to save Skater Boy, who then suggests that she turn into a skateboard so that they can escape, and then they do. And so that's kind of our hero origin story. It's very, very simplistic, and I think perhaps could be more interesting, more coincidental, more dramatic, rather than just him working at a convenience store and her walking in. It kind of feels like the most basic way they could possibly have met, and so it doesn't really feel spectacular or memorable. And since we're trying to build the origin story of our superhero, it would be a little bit more compelling if it was just a more interesting way of them meeting up, like maybe her ship crash landing at a skate park while he's out at night shredding the pipe or something like that, just to kind of help build that connection between them, because it feels a little bit strange that we go from clerking at a late night convenience store to being a skateboarding superhero. It feels like we're missing a little bit of that connective tissue, and so I think that opening on an action sequence like we did with the first episode was very good, but I do think that this backstory is a little underwhelming. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting idea for an action superhero. We essentially have a main character who, as far as we know, is just a regular guy, and his superhero powers are that he's good at skateboarding and that he is working with a princess who can transform into any non-living object. And so it's a very different idea, and I think that with further development, once we kind of figure out why the aliens are after this princess and why she's here, and just once we kind of start to get a little bit more info, a little bit more context, we can kind of build up those stakes and build that intrigue. And so it's a fun idea, and as a somewhat fan of skateboarding, I am very curious to see where it goes from here and how it might develop. So good job on that. I look forward to more of it. And that brings us to the end. So we are now up to 60 series off of this silly Reddit post of mine, and I've still got more than 10 left to read and review, and I may open up slots for more. Maybe I'll make a new post since this one is over a week old now. Because, again, I plan to review everything that is brought to my attention, every response to this thread that is a valid contest entry I will read and review, because it's been very fun to do so. This kind of gets me out of my own genre a little bit. I've been primarily focusing on the most gripping category in terms of entries that I've just been reading on my own, because that is the category that I entered, and so it's the one that I'm the most interested in. But seeing so much of what is out there in the other genres has been very entertaining, very intriguing indeed, and so I hope to see some more of them, and I can't wait to finish everything that I've got already. But if you enjoyed this video and the commentary and whatnot, you can consider checking out my entry, which is this one, Dumpster Girl. It's a horror story about a ghost and a dumpster. So I think that's about all I've got for now. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here, but I will see you in your nightmares.